2020 has been quite the year. In so many ways, personally and professionally, we have had to focus on the things that matter most to us in order to survive and, where possible, thrive. And one of the most critical things we've had to focus on is data. Whether it's the number of positive cases, the number of hospitalizations, how many beds are available for those hospitalizations. We've needed those numbers and that data, and we needed them yesterday. But at the same time as this great need for that data has come, we have also run full bore into the challenges and the limitations of that very data. We've had difficulty getting the data. We've had difficulty analyzing the data. We've even had difficulty agreeing what the very measures we need actually mean and how to define them. For example, what do we mean by COVID deaths? Do we mean anyone who died while infected with the coronavirus? Or do we mean people who died because of the symptoms caused by a coronavirus infection? It was enough, understandably, to make citizens and decision makers question the usefulness of analytics and whether they're actually worth the incredible investment that they require. Even in non-pandemic times, organizations and individuals face resource limitations that make them question whether it's worth investing any of those scarce resources into analytics when the return can sometimes seem so questionable or so hard to quantify. But analytics is something that we desperately need as individual decision makers and organizational decision makers in order for our individual selves and our businesses to survive and to thrive. And to illustrate this point, I want to tell a story about another infectious scourge that we in the Western world have largely forgotten about now, but that we did once upon a time use analytics to understand how this disease was passed and what we could do to stop it. So the year is 1854 and the place, London. London was one of the busiest and biggest cities at the time, growing astronomically thanks to industrialization and a boom of jobs in the city. But the increasing crowding and lack of sanitation was causing an outbreak of incredible proportions in many different kinds of diseases. And the most feared of all was cholera. We know today that cholera is caused by a bacterial infection that creates incredible intestinal distress and in the matter of just a couple of hours can cause severe dehydration, septic shock, and death. And London officials knew that cholera was a threat because they had begun collecting cause of death on death certificates. So they could see when a spike in cholera-caused deaths occurred in different places across London. And this illustrates the first reason that we need data. After all, the only reason that those in a leadership position even would know about the outbreaks is because they were collecting data on why people were dying across the city. And that data would flag when there was a cholera outbreak. So, reason one, we need data to even know that something is a problem. And when we know something's a problem, we need data to know the scope of that problem. In this way, data also can be the voice of the voiceless or the less heard, right? The lords of London sitting in their fancy houses in the nicest, poshest parts of London, they may not have noticed a cholera outbreak. They couldn't talk to the people, and they oftentimes weren't visiting those neighborhoods. But because the death certificates represented everybody across the city, every death counted on those death certificates, the data were able to represent everybody in the city, including those in impoverished neighborhoods who otherwise would have been missed. So London leaders knew they needed to do something about cholera, thanks to data. But what would they do about it? Again, the prevailing wisdom of the time was these miasmas, the bad air. And they had that anecdotal evidence to suggest that places that reeked from the open sewage in the cities, those were the areas hardest hit by cholera. So based on that anecdotal evidence, the newly created Board of Health actually recommended that they pipe and divert sewage as quickly as possible away from places where people lived, which meant that they were dumping it directly into the Thames, the major river that ran through London. And of course, because we now know that cholera is passed through infected water, this decision, based just on anecdotal evidence, actually made things so much worse. The infected sewage was getting into the drinking water in the Thames. People would pull their drinking water out of the Thames, and it would be infected with cholera. Fortunately, though, at the time there was a young physician who did not buy the miasma story. He thought that, in fact, infected water might be the source, though he didn't know about germs or bacteria yet. And so he headed into the latest outbreak in Soho, a terrible outbreak of cholera that had caused 600 deaths in less than a week. And he counted every single death and marked it on a map. Together with a pastor, he went door to door and made sure he knew exactly where each person who had died from cholera actually lived. And this is the map that he was able to produce. Do you see what he noticed? The deaths seemed to cluster around a single pump on Broad Street. Just as the death certificate data alerted officials of cholera's growing threat, Dr. Snow's analysis and clever visualization determined that the deaths were not equally distributed across the neighborhood. If they had been caused by air quality, they should have been equally distributed. After all, the air couldn't be that different, just one straight over. And his map also showed a few critical exceptions. For example, this beer brewery, it's in the heart of the outbreak, yet it had virtually no deaths. Again, if the cause were air, how could this be explained? But if, instead, the cause were the water from the pump, this made sense because the brewery had its own water source. So armed with his analysis, Dr. Snow was able to recommend a different choice. Instead, he said, my data show that this pump is linked to the outbreak. And so he convinced city officials to remove the handle from the pump. And the outbreak in Soho ended. So this is the second reason that we need data. If you aren't informing your actions with data about the situation and what might work, you will not be able to choose the course of action that has the best chance of making a difference. After all, the city officials used something that sounded good. It made logical sense that these bad airs were causing the outbreaks, but because they didn't look at the detailed information to test that hypothesis, they made a choice that actually made things worse. And John Snow, with his door-to-door information and the detailed information about the deaths, was able to show that miasmas could not be the cause. And instead, the evidence pointed very strongly to contaminated water being the cause. And so, knowing that contaminated water was likely the cause, it led him to take an action that was more likely to have an impact. Removing the handle from that infected pump stopped people from continuing to drink infected water and continuing to fall ill. The systems that we work with today are as complex as outbreaks, whether we're in business, finance, sales, or just trying to make decisions about our own personal life, or maybe medical decisions about our health. They're all so complicated that just basing it off a few anecdotes or stories or common sense will oftentimes lead us down the wrong path. And that is why we need data wherever possible, whenever we can find it, to help inform our decisions for us to make the best choice that we can at the time. But John Snow did not stop with just removing the pump handle. He wanted to know for sure that that was the correct intervention. And so he broadened that intervention, and he looked at the two biggest water suppliers in the city of London. And he convinced one of those water suppliers to divert where they were pulling the water from to upstream of the city. So they were pulling water from the Thames before it reached the city and before it became so contaminated with sewage. And then Dr. Snow tracked the cholera deaths and other infections that were happening for individuals who received their water from outside London and those who received water still from within. And his data conclusively showed that the cleaner water led to fewer deaths. And so this is the third reason that we need data. Data helps us, once we've made an intervention, to know whether our intervention is taking us in the direction we want to go. Without tracking thoughtful and appropriate outcome measures, and using that data to check our cardinal direction, how will we know if our intervention actually made the thing we want happen? How do we know if we're going in the right direction, or if in fact, like diverting sewage into the Thames, we're going in the very wrong direction? So the three reasons we need data. Data help us know when there even is a problem or a challenge to be faced and let us know the scope of that problem. Reason two, we need data to help inform our decisions about the actions that we take so that we have the best chance of those actions having the outcome we want. And third, we need data and analytics to help us check our progress and know if we are headed in the right direction or if we need to course correct. So 200 years ago, Dr. John Snow showed us that we can use data and analytics to stop one of the most dangerous infectious diseases that the people of London faced at the time. And we still can do that today. We don't need fancy computers or complex technology. Dr. Snow did what he did with a clipboard and some shoe leather on the concrete. We can do the same by being thoughtful and intentional with the analytics that we collect and paying attention to the questions that we ask of the data we already have. We can work to help the people in our companies, in our families, in our communities understand and be comfortable with basic data so we can use them in the decisions that we face every single day. So hopefully we can see that analytics are critical to making high quality decisions and bringing us the outcomes and the change in the world, in our community, in our lives, in our businesses that we want to see.